front lawn for this final session before the closing debate. The session is titled City of Lies, Love and Death in Tehran. And the guests for the session are Ramita Navai in conversation with Sam Kiley. Ramita Navai is an author and foreign correspondent who has reported from over 35 countries for both print and television. She has won multiple awards, including an Emmy for her documentary on Syria, the Robert F. Kennedy Award for her documentary on Iraq, and a Royal Television Society Award. Her book, City of Lies, which is the subject of this afternoon's discussion, won an award for debut political book of the year. And she'll appear in conversation with Sam Kiley, who has covered conflicts in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia for more than 25 years. And he is a senior correspondent at CNN. He's also the author of Desperate Glory, an Economist Book of the Year. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ramita Navai and Sam Kiley.
Afternoon, everybody. This is a real treat for me, not just to be here at the Jaipur Literary Festival, but I'm going to be talking to one of my favorite people about one of my favorite books. And both of those statements are true. Although after 5 days in each other's company, things may be weighing a bit thin. But Ramita's is, just to give you a little bit of background about Ramita, as we were being introduced there, she is sort of hilariously modest about her achievements and almost bashful, but she is one of Britain's leading current affairs documentary makers. And this book that she has written is one of the most extraordinary books because it is a work of non-fiction, but like all good narrative non-fiction, it reads like fiction. It is kind of almost unbelievable. And over many years of cross-questioning, she has been resolute in defending it as non-fiction, or at least not made up. And it is a series of portraits of individuals and places in modern Tehran, a city that I have never visited, and so can only really see through Ramita's eyes. But it is a city that, for all the grubbiness and intrigue and pain and often hilarity of her book, I'm still desperate to get to. They just won't give me a visa. Ramita, though, you're a Brit, you're Iranian. How did you end up writing this book? How did you come to write it?
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and hi everyone, thanks for coming. So I went back to Iran, as you know. Can everyone hear me? Is that better? I went back to Iran as an adult, so I was born there, but I grew up in London. I went back as an adult to work there as a journalist, and I was working as the Tehran correspondent for the Times of the UK. And how I came to write this book is that my press card was revoked. So if you're a journalist working in Iran, you monitor yourself, you self-censor, because as a journalist, you're quite heavily monitored by the intelligence services, as I was. There are parallel intelligence agencies in Iran, and I didn't know which intelligence agency was monitoring me. The Ministry of Islamic Culture and Guidance, under whose jurisdiction I fell, they told me it wasn't their people. And you get a phone call to give you a sense of how you're monitored as a journalist there. You get a phone call with instructions of where to meet. You've got to keep this meeting secret. And you turn up, and there are usually two men, good cop, bad cop. And they make it be known that they've been following you, they know where you've been, they knew who you've spoken to, and it's a pretty intimidating process. It's meant to intimidate you, and it does. It's not very pleasant. So you're made aware that you're being watched and monitored, and you have to censor your work. Even Western journalists in Iran censor their work, and every now and then somebody will write something they shouldn't write, and they'll get chucked out, which actually happened to a few of our colleagues when I was there. And the red lines, pretty obvious. You can't really write anything against religion, against the supreme leader. You have to be careful about corruption stories and human rights stories. And it didn't take long for me to piss off the regime. It took about 3-4 months. And usually they don't tell you what you do. They just revoke your press card. By the way, I was very lucky, because all that happened to me is that I had my press card revoked in this case. Many of my friends and colleagues have been imprisoned. Many famous cases that you will have heard about in the news. So I was just going to get a slap on the wrist. And normally they don't tell you what you've done wrong. In my case, they did tell me. And I'd done 2 things that the regime didn't like. The first was that I'd covered a human rights case. It was the case of an old revolutionary who turned against the system. He was in prison, he was on hunger strike, and I'd written about it. They didn't like that, because he was one of their own who turned against the system. The second thing I had done is that I had written about a cult film that had come out in the cinemas called The Lizard. Now, when it came out, I went to the opening night at a downtown cinema. And The Lizard is about a convict who escapes from prison dressed as a mullah. And there's one scene in the film where he's standing on the side of the road, dressed as a mullah, trying to hail a cab, and no cab will stop for him. And by the way, in Tehran, that's not unusual. Cab drivers, if you're in a cab in Tehran, often, if they drive past a mullah, they wind down the window. Not only do they not stop for the mullahs, they wind down the window and they start shouting all sorts of expletives. You fat so-and-so, you're the reason our country's in this mess. So in the film, when this scene happens, the whole of the cinema erupts into wild applause, starts howling with laughter. So I wrote about that. And in the article I wrote about that, I started the article with, have you heard the one about the mullah and the duck? Iranians love a good mullah joke. Turns out the regime are not so fond of a good mullah joke. So for those 2 reasons, I got my press card banned. And I didn't want to just sit at home, so I decided to do something useful. And I volunteered to teach in a school downtown in South Tehran for children without papers. So they were children of Afghan migrants, children of prostitutes, and children of gypsies. And back then, these 3 groups of children didn't have the right to an education. So there were these schools for them set up by charities. And at the same time as I did that, I'd befriended a prostitute that I'd met in a methadone clinic. She was a heroin addict, and she was HIV positive. And these 2 experiences just opened up a new world for me, a new Tehran that I hadn't seen. You know, a Tehran of brothels, of madams and pimps and parks strewn with needles. And I realized that this was a Tehran that was not being written about. And I'd go back up north, so I'll quickly give you, cut me short if I'm rambling. I'll give you quick geography of Tehran. Very basic terms. North Tehran is kind of richer, more liberal, more elite. South Tehran is more religious, more working class. That's a very basic geography. Of course, when the revolution happened, it was a bit like a meat mixer, and you know, there are pockets of everybody everywhere. But in basic terms, that's the divide. And of course, as a journalist, as an expat, you live in your North Tehran bubble. And I'd go from South Tehran to North Tehran, and I'd tell my Iranian friends, born and bred in Iran, some of the stories I was hearing, and they would be open-mouthed. And I realized these are stories the regime not only doesn't want outsiders to see, these are stories the regime doesn't want its own people to know about. And that's when I realized this is the real Tehran for me. This is far more representative of what's happening in the country, these ordinary people's voices we never hear in working class South religious Tehran, rather than, the interminable nuclear crisis or the sanctions, the political intrigues. I realized that this was the Tehran that was going to really tell me something interesting about my country.
And it most certainly is interesting and frequently hilarious. You mentioned the mullahs there. I wonder if you could read to us the passage that introduced the idea of religious guidance or religious guides as agony aunts.
Right. So I think what you're referring to, it's sex and mullahs. So sex is heavily legislated in Iran. As with, I imagine there are some parallels here in India, socio-cultural parallels, but as with anything that's repressed, that's oppressed, people become obsessed with it. So in Iran, society is obsessed with sex, and certainly the lawmakers are obsessed with sex. And on a serious note, there is a problem. Porn has been discussed in parliament. Prostitution has been discussed in parliament. There's a big prostitution problem in Tehran. And actually, let me read you. Shall I read?
Yeah, read that bit.
Let me read you this one paragraph about sex in Tehran. And this is where the clerics come in. So the clerics are very specific when it comes to legislating about sex, and specific when it comes to what you can and what you can't do. And the specificity can shock. And everyone has a favorite fatwa, but I think most Iranians, I'm going to read you my famous fatwa, and a fatwa, of course, is a religious edict. And I'm going to read you my favorite fatwa. This is absolutely true. So, it is impossible to escape sex in Tehran. Everyone knows that the streets are full of working girls. Prostitutes are part of the landscape, blending in with everything else. Pornographic photos are Bluetoothed across the city. Strangers send obscene images to strangers sitting opposite them on the underground, or in a cafe, or passing in the streets. Internet chat rooms and social sites are full of hookups and file shares for sex. XXX porn channels are beamed in by satellite. The channels unlocked for a premium price by black market television technicians. The regime valiantly goes into battle against sex. It's obsessed by how its people are having it and whom they are having it with. Lawmakers and scholars devote hours to discussing sex, philosophizing sex, condemning sex, sentencing sex. Mullahs issue countless fatwas on it. Some have become the stuff of legends. One of the nation's favorites, astounded with its specificity, sorry, I can't say that word, issued shortly after the revolution. It was a hypothetical scenario raised on television by a cleric called Ayatollah Gilani. Here it is. If you are a young man sleeping in your bedroom, and your aunt is sleeping in the bedroom directly below, and there's an earthquake and the floor collapses, causing you to fall directly on top of her, and if you should both be naked, and you happen to have an erection, and you happen to land on her so that you unintentionally penetrate her, would the child of such an encounter be legitimate or a bastard? That was an actual question asked, and that's an actual fatwa.
Well, funnily enough, it's something that's always troubled me. What's the answer?
Legitimate, because it was all a horrible mistake, of course.
But I mean, and your book is peppered with these vignettes, and some of them very, very chilling. But the mullahs also play a role in terms of not just issuing these fatwas and answering these questions, but sort of as I said earlier on, as sort of agony aunts. They give advice, don't they? I mean,
yeah, I mean, you have mullah
do they charge?
You have, yes, you have premium telephone lines. They do Quranic divination. Oh, thank you very much.
Cup of cha.
Shall I read the one
Yeah,
on the
go
Quranic?
on. I mean, trying to get you to do it.
This is another one of his favorites.
I love this one.
So, right, so there are Find a Fatwa websites. So one of these characters.
Find a Fatwa website.
So my book is 8.
Salman Rushdie would obviously endorse that heavily.
My book is, there are 8 characters in my book and 8 stories. And one of the characters, and I'll talk you through the characters in a bit, but one of the characters is a religious young woman who's going through a divorce. And it's a big thing from her community to be divorcing. And she was a lovely young woman. You know, we came from very different worlds, but we had very frank conversations. And she was very open about what she thought of sex. And she wore, dressed head to toe in a chador, black chador. Underneath her chador, she was in her 20s. Underneath her chador, she wore, the global uniform of Zara, Mango, Benetton. She had 2 ear piercings. But she would weep whenever the supreme leader came on television. He was her hero. And she was very, very conservative. Now, she used to use these Find a Fatwa websites, and we went on them together. I spent hours on these fatwa websites. I thoroughly recommend it if anybody here understands Persian or has a friend who can translate. And this is why. Right. So there's a whole section on what these websites, and I hope this isn't too X-rated, but about masturbation. So this is something that greatly concerned this young woman, was how to fight lust, because she thought it was a bad thing. Somaya, she's called Somaya. Somaya often consulted Find a Fatwa websites to help solve her more personal dilemmas. She had read a lengthy testimony from a doctor on the psychological damage caused by masturbation, not to mention the havoc it wreaked on the nervous system. There was also advice on how to resist the urge: exercising, reading about the prophets, fasting, avoiding anything that would stimulate lustful thoughts, avoiding people who were not religious, attending religious ceremonies, keeping busy, and marriage. Beneath the advice were the ubiquitous words, "Allah knows best." Samaya followed all these instructions. Someone had posted a question on the Supreme Leader's website. So the Supreme Leader has his own website, and there's a Find a Fatwa section on it. And people can post up their personal conundrums, and they get a reply. So this was a young man who'd written in, "I was talking to a woman I was not related to on the phone during Ramadan. And although I did not masturbate, and even though I did not intentionally phone her for sexual pleasure, I felt myself ejaculating. Please tell me if my fasting has been invalidated. If it has been invalidated, should I atone from this?" And the worried ejaculator had got a reply, "If you usually speak to a woman on the telephone without getting sexual pleasure from the conversation and without ejaculating, in this case, if you ejaculated without masturbating, your fasting has not been invalidated, and you do not have to atone for this." So,
I'm sure he wiped the sweat from his brow, quite literally, after that. This book isn't all about...
No, and forgive me for jumping straight into the rather rude parts. But you know, sex is really an everyday part of life, well, of all our lives, but particularly in a society like Iran, where it's closed, it's oppressed, it's claustrophobic. And people really, you know, and where there are rules, there are rules for everything. The state really meddles in the very private affairs of its citizens. So actually looking at sex is a very interesting way to take the temperature, is a very interesting way to see what's happening in society. You know, what has 40 years of Islamic rule done to a society and done to its sex and love lives? And actually on that note, I'd say there's a really interesting point that when you talk to the young, sex has become almost like an act of rebellion. And this is where it's a really important change. Iran is changing socioculturally because there's a sexual awakening among the young in Iran. And what's happening is that there's less pressure among the young to be virgins before marriage, for example. And this changes everything. And this is even among more religious working class societies where the young, you know, are breaking away. And many young people told me that where there are so many rules governing what they can and can't do, what they can and can't say, they feel that only in sex do they feel absolute ultimate control, that they have control of their bodies. And also quite a few young people told me that they felt that, you know, it was a kind of one-fingered salute to the state when they had sex, that you can't control this.
Now, as you were saying, there are 8 characters, there are 8 sort of episodes or people drawn in this book. Explain to me how you happened upon those characters and how they came to have so much life on the page here, because obviously, I mean, you're talking to people who are prostitutes, drug dealers, I mean, among other things, a judge, but all would have something to hide from the system.
Yeah, so shall I talk you through the characters? So very quickly, I've got a young Iranian living in exile who returns to Iran. He's joined the Mujahideen and he's on a secret assassination mission. I've got Somaya, the housewife we just talked about, who's going through a divorce. I've got a young student activist who's being monitored by the state, a crystal meth mobster, a porn star. She's really a prostitute who makes sex videos, but she likes to think of herself as a porn star. I've got an Islamic militiaman who's grappling with his sexual identity. And I've got an aging gangster who's very religious, but doesn't see anything wrong with boozing, and he runs a gambling den. And this is kind of old Tehran, and the old Tehran that's dying, pre-revolution Tehran, where it was perfectly acceptable to be very religious and also to drink hard. And I've got an uptown socialite. So I wanted to cover, for me it was really important to cover all the social classes. And I think outsiders often see Iran as this kind of monolith, that it's, you know, full of headbanging religious crazies, or actually that they see it as a divided city, the simple notion that it's divided, and you've got religious fundamentalists on one side, and you've got kind of the elite, rich partygoers on the other. Whereas actually Iran is far more interesting, complex, nuanced society. And it's really hard to pigeonhole people. And I'll give you an example. So you can have really religious men, even clerics, who believe in a separation between the state and religion. You can have a man whose wife wears the chador or the hijab, who covers herself, whose children, daughters cover themselves, yet who believes that the hijab, the chador, should not be mandatory. And likewise, you can have, you know, very sophisticated, urbane Iranians who travel abroad, young men who travel abroad, who have girlfriends, and who party, have Western educations. They come back to Iran and insist on marrying a virgin. So there were all these sorts of layers. And so for me, it was really important that I presented the real Tehran, the complex Tehran that I was seeing. And of course, actually, on that note, it's also important to remember that most of Tehran now is middle class. So there aren't these extremes. There's a huge middle class in Tehran. And it took me, gosh, so I lived in Tehran for 3 years reporting for the Times, and then I went back every year. And it's when as I told you, when my press card was revoked, that I started meeting some of these characters. And over the course of 10 years, it took me a long time, especially with the drug dealers, to gain their trust and to write these stories, to get these stories. So I'd say, yeah, it took me years and years. And of course, people were very scared, especially, you know, there are a few people who were wanted by the state, a few political stories in this, and people were very scared to talk. You know, in Iran, the stakes are much higher. So I had to keep everybody safe.
And one of my kind of most intriguing characters in this book is the judge who sent so many people to their deaths, and then we meet him much later in life. We hear his history, we learn his history, and then we meet him later in life when he is kind of racked with self-doubt that maybe he didn't do the right thing. He was somebody who was a believer who was losing his faith, was he? Or just describe him a little bit for me.
Right, so one of the stories, it's actually my favorite story. It's got a real place in my heart. It's about a young man called Amir, and he told me his story over lunch in my kitchen, and he hadn't said it for a long time. And he gets a phone call one day it's an elderly voice on the other side of the line, and this man says, "I knew your parents. I'd love to meet you. Come and meet me this place, this time." And Amir puts the phone down. He says, "Yes, yes, of course." Puts the phone down and then starts getting a bit nervous. He said, "Yes, yes, of course," because, you know, in Iran, it's an older person. You have to be respectful. He didn't question the voice. But he also realized that it was his number didn't come up on his phone. And he's worried that he's being monitored by the state. You know, he's hanging out with student activists. He's blogging. He turns up and to the proposed meeting place, and just as he was about to turn around, he kind of got a little bit spooked. This car pulls up, the tinted windscreen goes down, and there's an old man sitting in the back of a car. And so Amir feels perfectly safe, looks like a nice, slightly fat old man, sits in the car starts going up the highway, exchange pleasantries. And then the old man starts to shake. And then he says, "You must forgive me, you must forgive me, you must forgive me. I am the judge who sentenced your parents to death." And Amir's parents, when the revolution happened, They had been pro-revolution, they'd been leftists. Leftist intellectuals that had, went and protested for the revolution. When the revolution, they were also secular. When the revolution they felt was hijacked by the Islamists, they started to turn against the revolution, and they held secret meetings, political meetings, where everybody, all the dissidents were welcome. And they got arrested, along with Amir, when he was little, and he remembers this well. And they got thrown into prison. First of all, in the town where he was from in Iran, and then they got transferred to Evin prison in Tehran. And he remembers one day being with his mother in the prison cell. All the women were together in one cell, and all the children would play, and he was playing with his little friend. And every now and again, his mother would be taken out for interrogation sessions, but, she'd come back an hour or two later. And so she'd always tell him when she'd leave, and he was playing with his little friend, and his mother said, Amir, darling, I'm going to be back. And Amir was busy playing with his little friend, so didn't bother kind of hugging his mum. Bye, yes, okay, see you in a bit. And his mum left, and a few hours later, everybody was sobbing in the prison cell. And that's when little Amir was told that his mother had been hanged. And it was only when he was escorted out of the prison that day that he realized at the same time his father had also been hanged. And this was part of the 1988 mass executions of prisoners, and many were members of the MEK. His parents weren't. And these trials often lasted 5 minutes. They were devastating trials, and they were often trick questions. So I'll give you an example. One of the questions, there'd be a judge, often a mullah, there'd be a judge, a mullah, and they'd sentence you there and there. And one of the questions to test you would be, was your father a religious man? How would you answer that?
No.
How would you also? No, but if you were about to be tried?
I suppose one would say yes.
How would you all answer? You'd say yes, wouldn't you? The trick question. No was the right answer. If you said yes, they'd kill you. If you said no, the reasoning would be, well, if your parents couldn't teach you the right way, how was he supposed to know? They were trick questions. And so Amir's parents were executed on the spot by this judge. Now, this judge, fast forward a couple of decades, and this judge was racked with guilt, absolute guilt. He'd signed loads of death sentences, and he'd started to get in touch with all the children whose parents he'd killed. Amir was the only child who'd had both his parents. This judge had signed death warrants, but execution warrants for both his parents. And Amir developed a very strange relationship with this judge. This judge wouldn't leave him alone. This judge wanted forgiveness. This judge thought if he didn't get forgiveness, he would not be forgiven by God. And Amir was the only, and he tried to give Amir gifts, gold watches. He'd leave presents outside his house. And then finally, Amir just got sick of this old man and started allowing him into the house, into his flat, and they'd just sit there in silence. And Amir would say, I dreamt of this day, of meeting this judge who'd killed my parents. And I dreamt that I'd beat him up, but I'd just sit there, and he was just a frail old man. And it made Amir feel even worse about himself, how impotent he felt. And Amir was the only child who never forgave this judge. All the others forgave him, and that's why the judge wouldn't leave him alone. And actually, when I wrote this story, Amir had, and this brings me on to an interesting point on some of the stories and how I wrote them. Amir said to me, listen, you can tell my story, but I have one request. You do not talk to this judge. I'm trying to extricate myself from him. This is a screwed up relationship. I don't want him in my life. I don't know how to get rid of him. Please don't talk to him. So this is what I did in this book, in quite a few instances like this. So I'd either use composite characters or, where there was a gap like this, I had to find another judge. And that wasn't an easy thing to do. Another judge who'd been in the revolutionary courts at the same time. There were quite a few of them, but who'd also signed execution warrants, death warrants. But you know what? There are quite a few of these old revolutionaries who now are full of regret, not publicly. And a lot of journalists, a lot of people helped me get to these people, and I found that judge. I found a few of them. and I found this one judge who lived in absolute regret, who told me, in great detail how he'd stoned someone, how he went to a stoning, how you had to be seen to throw stones, even though he didn't want to throw stones. And that's how I got his story. On a good note, I'm still in touch with Amir. On a good note, he has been given asylum in Europe because, of course, your name is always kind of slightly blackened if your parents were known to have been executed by the regime because they were seen as dissidents. So he always felt like the outsider and that the state was against him. And there are mass graves, by the way, unmarked mass graves still in Tehran. It's quite hard for Iranians to visit these graves without feeling that they're being marked. So he's now got asylum and he's very happy. And actually, he gives this book, now it's kind of this secret that he's trying to unburden himself of. It was a big secret in Tehran. And now he gives his story, gives this book to friends and lovers and people he cares about when he wants them to know his story, but he doesn't want to reveal it himself because it's too painful and emotional.
Well, let's hope he's got lots of lovers, you get lots of sales. But Amir's not his real name. How have you been able to protect the people? Because every single character in this book has, kind of the clues in the title, they have something to hide. In order to function, your thesis really is, in City of Lies, is that lying, dissembling, is a necessary survival skill in Tehran. Perhaps one that you could explain a bit more, and also how did you create these characters who are true? They're true stories, but they're kind of fictitious people.
Well, I have a problem with you saying fictitious people. Amir is not a fictitious person. Somaya is not a fictitious person. Farida is not a fictitious person. So these are very real people, and everything in this book is true. So what was the first bit of your question?
How have you? You've got to protect these people. They're living lies.
Yeah. So I was very, very careful. This is my job. This is our job. This is what we do. So in order to be trusted, you have to do everything you can to keep your sources safe. It's just the basics of the journalism that we do. And actually, people did trust me. So Tehran is a sprawling city, but, like so many big cities, it's also a village. And actually, if you're a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, there's automatically a bond there. There's automatically some level of trust. I also showed, so some of them were a bit skeptical, and I showed them some of the work I've done from Syria, Afghanistan, from Zimbabwe, where I have blurred everybody's faces, where they've seen the measures I've gone to protect people. Also, I was very careful. I had some young journalists. I had one in particular who was working for me. She was helping me fact check. She was coming along with me to interviews. She helped me a lot. Now, I was really concerned about her. I didn't even have her number in my mobile. We had a system of getting in touch with each other to keep her safe. And she was much more lax about it than I was. She wanted to phone me, she wanted to email. No, I was very careful. So that extended to all these people I spoke to. Especially with, drug dealers as well, who, they might retaliate. They're pretty hard people, these guys. In fact, interestingly, the drug dealers I was hanging out with, and the way I got to these drug dealers is really interesting. So the drug dealers, originally I wanted it to be a gun runner, and that's an executionable offense, and that turned out to be too difficult, so I couldn't profile a gun runner in the end, and so it became a crystal meth dealer. And drugs, and I'll talk about drugs in a minute, drugs is a very big problem in Iran. But these drug dealers that I started hanging out with, was pretty amazing. They'd all been henchmen. They'd all been kind of heavies in the Japanese Yakuza. And there was a whole migration of Iranians to Japan for work after the Iran-Iraq war, and the Japanese economy had collapsed, and they were in need of workers. And many of these Iranians had stayed, and many of them had ended up in the Yakuza, and some of them had worked their way up the ranks. And so these guys had come back, and there were heavies on the streets of Tehran. They had amazing Japanese tattoos. There were Japanese graffiti on the streets in Tehran. And I found these drug dealers, and that was a hard one, you know, getting drug dealers to trust you, getting them to open up, getting them to talk. But a friend of mine was a film director, and he made a film, and he's a well-known, celebrated film director, has won a few awards. He'd made a film, and in his film, he wanted to have some heavies, some kind of South Tehran, you know, gangsters. So he'd gone to South Tehran, he'd gone to all the dodgy places, and, you know, just as extras in the background, and he'd advertised, and a whole load of them, of course, these heavies are all very buff and very vain, and they want to get their muscles on screen. And they all ended up auditioning and getting a part in his film, and he made friends with some of these guys, and they were very, very loyal to him. And they'd do anything to get a part in the pictures, to get a part in the movies. And that's how I found this big drug dealer. It was through him. And on the issue of drugs, actually, drugs is a big, big problem in Iran. I love this anecdote, and it gives me a chance to talk about my grandmother who died a few years ago. So she was in Tehran when I was with her, and when I first moved there, I was living with her. So recently in Iran, and this is in my chapter about the gangster, crystal meth has overtaken heroin as the second drug of choice. So there's a big heroin problem. As you can imagine, it's on the drug, you know, Iran is on the drugs route. Also socio-cultural pressure, because it's so claustrophobic, there's not much to do. Lots of different reasons why drug addiction is so high there. But the number one drug is opium, and part of the reason is cultural. You know, opium was widely acceptable. It was an acceptable drug in Iran. And when I first got to Iran, my granny said to me, you know, she sat me down, she's talking about the dangers of Tehran. I was 13, of course, she still had to sit me down and talk to me about the dangers of Tehran. And she said, and she finally got to drugs, and she said, whatever you do, don't go anywhere near marijuana, hashish marijuana. Don't touch it. It's very dangerous. All the young are going crazy doing it. And I said, oh, okay, Granny. What about opium? She was like, opium's fine. Just don't go anywhere near hashish or marijuana. So that gives you an indication of how acceptable opium was. And there are still plenty of, you know, old back streets and where the sky is, where the air is thick with the smell of opium, you know, opium dens, cafes where they secretly smoke it in the back.
And explain to me how your composite characters work. I mean, it's a fascinating challenge in any fiction, let alone non-fiction, creating a character. But as you insist, your characters are real, but they are, in some cases, are they amalgams?
Yeah, so this is what you're talking about when you say fictitious. Yeah, so what I did, I have a few composite characters. And that's because I feel that if I hadn't used composite characters, I would have had a pretty one-dimensional picture. And this is because, for example, so one of my composite characters is a prostitute, which means I spoke to a few prostitutes and told a few different stories and made it one character. So I used the character of one prostitute, but the story of a few. And that's because one of the girls would tell me her story, or one of the women would tell me her story, and she'd say, but you can't write that, because if you write that, then my mum will know it's me. Or you can't write that, because then the state will know it's me. And so there were big gaps in their stories. So to fill in those gaps, I didn't want to write the kind of journalistic essay. I did not want this to be journalistic essays from Tehran. I wanted the reader to feel like they were sitting down with one of these characters, and Tehranis are great storytellers, and that these Tehranis were telling them their stories in the same language as they were, you know, swearing or with reverence or quoting from Hafez or quoting from the Quran, these extraordinary tales that they were telling me. And in order to do that, in order to have this full picture, I wanted to fill in those gaps and, have every single aspect of someone's lives. And that's why I had composite characters.
So they're not so much composite characters as characters who are carrying the stories of others
Exactly.
as part of their own makeup. So there are the individuals that we meet here. You may have changed their names, but each individual is real and has their story, and you've kind of enriched their lives with the stories of others.
Exactly. And of course, we're leaving out the final character of the book, which is Valias Street. So Valias Street, Tehran is the backdrop and a character, I hope, of the book. And Valias Street is another. And Valias Street is one of the biggest commercial streets in the world. It's about 12 miles long. And it was built by the Shah. Building started, Reza Shah, in about 1921. It's a magnificent road. So the Shah wanted it to have the kind of magnificence of a Roman road, kind of dead straight, big, wide, and the kind of splendor of the French boulevards. So on either side, he planted thousands of trees, sycamore trees, and there are gutters that run along either side with water that comes along them, that gushes straight down from the mountains. And you ask Tehranis what their favorite road is, 8 out of 10 Tehranis will tell you Valias Street. And we all have a Valias story, our favorite shop, our favorite bit of it, our favorite place. And the reason Valias is important to me and important to the book is because it connects these two worlds. It runs from North Tehran to South Tehran. So it runs from kind of the rich, elite, secular, liberal bubble, and all the different classes, and all the different levels of religiosity in between. And it hits working class, poor South Tehran. And it's a pretty extraordinary road, and that road is for everybody. It's for every single Tehrani. There's a posh bit of it, there's a great food bit of it, and everyone goes to every bit of this street.
You were mentioning earlier on we were joking about the sort of rent-a-fatwa websites and so on. In the research of this book, how widespread was this sense of religious hypocrisy?
Oh, God. Depends who you speak to. I think the middle classes they're very vocal now against the clerical establishment. In fact, some people say it's more open now than it was under the Shah. That actually, during the Shah, you had to be careful what you said about the Shah, whereas now people aren't careful what they say, what they think about the supreme leader, and what they say about the clerical establishment and the government. You get into a cab, you're at the butcher's, you're at the greengrocers, and people start complaining very openly. So that fear has gone. And there have been quite a few high-profile cases of, misconduct by clerics, of corruption. And it's a very interesting time right now because people are fed up with what's going on. What's also interesting is that people are starting to, people make the system work for themselves. So they're reclaiming some of these kind of old religious traditions. And one example is, you might have heard of this, Syria, it's called. It's temporary marriage. So you can be married for 5 minutes, to 99 years. And, usually it was looked down upon. So usually it was, in the olden days, it was concubines, and then, more recently it was kind of mistresses. So men could have mistresses, and it was given an Islamic seal of approval. They'd temporarily marry someone, because having more than one wife is unacceptable in Iran. This was a sneaky way of having a lover and not, being caught out by the clerical establishment. In fact, it was sanctioned by them. What young people have done is that they're now using Syria as a means to travel around the country and stay in hotels together and not get married, for example. So there are all these things that are happening that are, slowly, by beating the system, they're slowly eroding away at the system, which is really interesting. Actually, another interesting thing, talking about young people that's happening is living together before marriage. This is called Ezdavaj Sefid, white marriage. and more young people are doing this. Ordinary young people, by the way, not just your kind of rich upper class youngsters. But to such an extent that the Supreme Leader's office issued an edict, issued a statement about how terrible a thing this was. So there were lots of changes.
We got another 15 minutes. I'm sure I've been monopolizing the questions and enjoying Ramita's answers. Can we get some microphones? We've got microphones out in the audience. Would anybody like to pop a question? Sir, at the back there, I think you were the first to raise your arm. I think you got a green shirt on.
Hi, I have a question. It might be slightly unrelated to the discussion at hand. But recently I came across this article, and The Guardian is doing a series on the next 15 mega cities, and not in the Western context of it, but throughout the world. So The Guardian did an article on Tehran, and I read a response article to it, which said that the Guardian article harks on certain stereotypes which are talked about of third world cities which are coming up right now. So there is a certain gap in terms of literature or historiography of cities which are not in a Western context. So how do we bridge this gap between city writing which makes us miss out on certain complexities when we're reading about cities or city making, much like in your book, makes us miss out on certain complexities? How do we bridge the gap in that writing or that perception of different cities not in the Western context of it?
Reading my book. I heard about that Guardian article actually about, you know, the stereotypes. And the stereotypes are the ones I kind of went over at the beginning of this talk, but also, you know, the plastic surgery. All the girls have plastic surgery, and then it's a dirty, you know, dirty city, and there's lots of oppression and religious police and all that kind of, there is all of that stuff. And of course I covered it because you have to cover it, but there is another side to it. And I think the side that, the thing that Iranians are objecting to, and not so much the dirty truths that aren't there among the stereotypes, but I think that it's also in some ways flourishing. You know, there's a great art scene. You know, there are wonderful galleries, there are wonderful museums. So, you know, and as we spoke, you know, society is changing, young people are changing. I think that's the stuff that Iranians, you know, want the world to see as well. And I think journalists kind of fall into a trap, Western journalists fall into a trap by going there. They have this idea in their head, and when they arrive, they're like, oh my God, wow, I can't believe this X, Y, and Z is actually happening, and these people are actually like us. And that's not too interesting, really, because we're all really essentially the same. City of Lies could be about, you know, that could be the title of any city, really. It could be DC, it could be London, Delhi.
I mean, I think that's what's really striking about Ramita's book. For me, as a complete outsider, it's not a city I've ever been to, it's not a country I've even visited, is that whilst the stories that she tells in the book are very specific to Tehran, there is a universality about them. And I think the gentleman's question, kind of, joking aside, this sort of a book, it brings to mind for me, there's a Kenyan author, a pretty obscure one, called Major Mwangi. I'm Kenyan originally, and he wrote a book called Going Down River Road, which is about life in the slums in Kenya. And again, yes, you could say that it reinforced a Western cliche. Kenya has the biggest slum area in the world, Kibera slum. But actually, just as Ramita's book does, because it's written by an insider, it is completely free, and City of Lies is like this too. It is completely free of preconception and perception, pre-cooked perceptions. In fact, it very much subverts them. Got anybody else like a question? Yes, sir. Yes, sir, in the leather jacket there.
Thank you. So my question to you, ma'am, is regarding the lawmakers of Tehran. As you have worked there, you must have observed the culture of how lawmakers perform there. Now, considering this fact that around the world, the constitutions that are derived, that are ideologically not based on religion, they are based on rational studies and facts, and then a constitution is derived through certain perseverance. Whereas these Middle Eastern countries have seen their lawmaking through their religion books, through their religious texts. So when you say that there in North Tehran, you've seen liberals who are rising and now understanding these issues well. But have you observed any lawmakers in Tehran who are ready to rise above this, above their religions in order to be more rational in terms of implementing policies?
Well, yes, I mean, this is the internal political struggle in Tehran right now. I would say, by the way, you said liberals who have come to kind of accept liberal life. No, they've always been there. But yeah, this is the internal political struggle that's happening right now in Tehran within the government. You know, you have the reformists, and that was the reason for the 2009 protests, was that what was over the vote was, you know, basically that nobody believed that Ahmadinejad had won again. But what happened then is that the reformist leaders were seen as such a threat because they had the backing of the people, that the leaders were put under house arrest, and they're still under house arrest. So you have lawmakers who are pushing for reform, who do want reform. You know, you also have women's groups there who are pushing for women's rights. You have amazing lawyers, and lawyers who are in and out of jail, but who are pushing for reform and pushing for more liberal laws. So that's absolutely happening, but it's part of the internal struggle, and so far the hardliners are winning. And certainly with Trump pulling out of the nuclear deal, he's playing right into the hardliners' hands, and he's strengthening the hardliners' position.
Anybody else? Anybody? Yes, sir, here in the front. This gentleman here.
Thanks for such an fascinating and extraordinary tales about Tehran. But I just wanted to, I'm more interested in Iran as a country to know about it. What's the story in rest of the Iran apart from Tehran? Mm-hmm. And as a journalist point of view, the kind of investigative stories that you are doing, is it safer to stay away from Tehran or staying in Tehran and covering their stories?
So what happens in Tehran ultimately trickles out to the rest of the country. My book is very much about Tehran, though. So Tehran is the beating heart. And what happens? You know, having said that, actually, it's really interesting. You do have very liberal belts of the country, of Iran. So you've got the whole Caspian region, and you can go to villages in the Caspian region where the women don't have the headscarves on, where they wear bright-colored clothes, where they make their own alcohol, where they drink at weddings. You know, so it's actually not kind of, as you'd imagine, that you go to rural areas and they'd necessarily be much more conservative. No, not at all. But I did all my reporting in Tehran, but I traveled widely and reported from the country when I was there. I wrote most of the book there. So as I said, I lived there for 3 years reporting, but I went back every year for many years. And for the last 2 years when I was writing this book, I spent 5 months there. Now, have I been back since I wrote the book? No, I haven't. I would love to go back. I miss it dearly. I don't know whether it's safe for me to go back. I know that I was on some kind of list. I know that when I made a documentary from Syria, when I arrived in Iran after that, I was arrested at the airport and interrogated, and I was told in no uncertain terms that I couldn't cover Syria again because I had been with the rebels. But a lot of the statistics in this book are government statistics. So, you know, there's sex and drugs, but these have all been discussed in Parliament. These are discussed now in society. So it's not it won't be a shock to the state that I've written this. But of course, and I like to think it's not a political book, but of course, you know, in a country like Iran, everything is political. So who knows? You know, you never know whether you're safe or not as a journalist in that country.
It's also a debut political book of the year, so somebody thought it was political. Yes? Sir, there in the second row.
I just have a simple question. So what is the condition and what are the plights of the religious minorities in Tehran and Iran?
Right. Condition and plights of the religious minorities, for anyone who didn't hear. So Iran has a big Jewish community, A lot of Jews left when the revolution happened, but there's still a Jewish community there. There's a big Christian community. But I would say, and there's Smileys, Sunnis. I would say one of the religious minorities, though, that has had a really hard time are the Baha'is. And the Baha'is have had land taken from them. They have reduced rights. They don't have the same rights to education, to university, to jobs, especially not government jobs. And they are deeply oppressed. I was talking to a friend of mine who had to flee the country after the 2009 protests. He was taken across the border by Kurdish smugglers. He paid to be smuggled out of the country because he was about to be jailed for a very long time. And the other people who were being smuggled out and waiting to be smuggled out, most of them were Baha'is. So yeah, they have a tough time in Iran. Of course, Zoroastrians as well, because of course we have a connection. The Zoroastrians of Iran came to Bombay and are now the Parsis in this country. But the Zoroastrians there, the leaders of these communities are always monitored. But generally they have an okay time. The Armenians, who are the Christians in Iran, by the way, they can have their own clubs. They have licenses to make their own alcohol. So often your booze dealers are Armenian. They make great red wine. And they have their own, resorts where men and women, unlike any other part of Iran, men and women can be in bikinis together and mixed together, but only if you're Armenian, you're Christian. So actually the Armenians have it pretty good in Iran. They have it better than the Muslims and the Jews and the Zoroastrians.
Yes, sir, there in the black. And then the gentleman next to him next.
I want to know, what is the Kurdish experience like in Iran?
Right, well, so if you look at the list of executions every year, so Iran has a startlingly high execution rate. So Iran is one of the biggest jailers of journalists in the world, and it's got one of the highest execution rates behind China. And what's the other country? I think Iran is usually about third on the list. If you look at the list, it's usually drug trafficking, drug dealers, and Kurds. Many Kurdish dissidents are executed every year. So there's strict monitoring on Kurds. And you've got, the Kurds to the north that everybody talks about and knows about. What's interesting, you've also got the Baluchi movement, which is the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And you've also got Arab Iranians in Khuzestan, and they are heavily monitored as well. So, the Kurds have a tough time, as they do in all of the countries that they inhabit.
Yes, sir, in the grey jacket.
Yes. Hello. I am a surgeon. I have been to Iran for 8 years during Iran-Iraq war. Whatever you have told, I have witnessed that spying is done on all the Iranians, especially the Islamic Guards. They prosecute if you indulge in any political activity. I was in Ahvaz, near Basra, where the war was going on. I remained there for 8 years. And the main thing is that this present Islamic government doesn't want to show the Iran which was before the Islamic era. That is what one of my friends asked, the purse policy. The purse policy is, you see the...
So what's your question rather than a comment?
Oh, that I'm just telling that this prosecution is, and this government is, liberals are not allowed to function. And whosoever is allowed to contest, they have to take permission from one council of the Islamic councils.
Thank
then
you.
You can contest, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam there. Finally, a woman in here managed to spot.
an Iranian American woman at that.
Salon.
So I haven't been to Iran for over 40 years, but my question is about women in Iran. So looking at Iran from the outside, it seems like a male-dominant society, oppressive to women. I wanted to know your thoughts about especially young women in Iran, their rights, what's available to them.
Well, on one hand, you're right. You know, if you look at the laws, you know, it's a patriarchal society. If you look at the laws, they're all weighted against women. It's not easy being a woman in Iran where you don't have the same divorce laws, inheritance laws, where there are social expectations on you to, you know, be a virgin when they're not the same social expectations on men. You're absolutely right. However, as you know, in our culture, it's quite extraordinary when you see women's roles within the household and women's roles actually within wider society, that Iranian women are strong. And often Iranian women are the people who rule the roost in the house, who have the purse strings, who decide what happens in the house. And this is also across the board. I would say that this is one thing that gives me hope, is young Iranian women. I am so moved by them. They are so brave. And I've seen them so many times go out on Women's Day. Every year in Iran, they'll go out and protest. And often they'll get beaten up. They'll be in and out of prison. And they'll carry on protesting just for basic stuff, for basic divorce rights, for basic inheritance rights. And that's where I look. That's where I have hope. And that's hopefully where our future is with these young, amazing, brave young women, courageous Iranian women.
And time for one last question, if there is one. Otherwise, yes, madam, here.
Hi, you'd mentioned the border with Pakistan, which triggers my question. So I'm curious to know how Iran sees India and Pakistan, you know, both in political terms, geostrategic terms, and just as two old civilizations that neighbored each other.
Well, you know, at the moment, Iran is so obsessed and bogged down by what is happening in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, that actually that talk of Iran, India and Pakistan has really been eclipsed by what's happening across the border. And as you know, and I'm sorry that I can't elucidate on this, and that's because you turn on the news or the conversation when it comes to foreign policy, apart from England and America, is all about Iranians in Syria, Iranians in Iraq, and Iranians in Afghanistan. And that's absolutely taken over, unfortunately, from the relationship we should be having with the wider region.
Great. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I do hope you go and buy Ramita's book, City of Lies. It's available in the bookshop across the way. Thank you, Ramita.
Thanks so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank